My name is Patricia and I am 35 years old, the age at which, as it seemed to me, a person should already understand how this world works, how to protect themselves from the blows of fate, how to build a strong foundation under their feet so that no storms could shake it. But, as often happens, life bursts into your world without warning and destroys everything that you considered solid and unshakable. I work as an office worker in a modest, unremarkable company, which, however, gave me a sense of stability and order, providing, albeit not brilliant, but quite a calm life, in which there was a place for habits and morning coffee, and the confidence that tomorrow will not bring any special surprises. My life has always seemed simple to me, even predictable. I have never sought thrills and did not strive for turbulent changes, preferring reliability and consistency. My husband, Durant, and I had been married for 5 years, and while we weren't exactly rich, we were living comfortably. We had a cozy, if slightly outdated, home, a couple of vacations a year, modest but nice gifts for each other on holidays, and, most importantly, mutual understanding, or at least that's what I thought. All this lasted until the day when a financial burden suddenly fell on our shoulders and literally crushed us, a debt that, as Durant said, we had to pay off for his mother's sake, urgently and without unnecessary questions. And before we continue, write in the comments from which city you are watching this video. Enjoy. The situation seemed tense from the very beginning, but I tried to stay calm, believing that this was only a temporary difficulty that we could overcome if we were thrifty and united. We began cutting back on everything from our favorite grocery brands to our most essential medical visits, and I soon realized that we were no longer just living modestly, but on the edge of survival. That's why, when Mrs. Ferrari, my mother-in-law, suddenly started talking about her upcoming trip to Cancun, not as a pipe dream, but as a real, almost decided plan, I was almost speechless from surprise and the internal protest that rose up inside me like a hot wave. "Are you kidding?" I asked, not hiding my shock. "What do you mean, a trip to Cancun?" My voice was tense, and although I didn't intend to speak to her in a raised voice, the excitement, irritation, and deep resentment that had built up over the past months burst out before I had time to hold them back. Mrs. Ferrari seemed genuinely surprised by my reaction. Her eyes widened, her lips twitched, as if she didn't understand what I was talking about, and this lack of understanding was disconcerting. "Patricia, my dear, but I never asked you for anything like this," she began quietly, with a note of confusion in her voice. And then, at that very moment, like a cold stream of ice water rushing over my head, I heard something that completely changed my perception of reality. She, the very woman for whom, as it seemed to me, we had sacrificed our peace of mind, our health, and our financial situation, had not asked us for help from the very beginning. The money that I had scrupulously saved, denying myself the most basic things, was not used to pay her debts, because she had no debts. All this was Durant's initiative. He, and he alone, decided that we should pay, and he kept me in the dark all these months. I felt something breaking inside me, my legs giving way, anxiety, bewilderment, and anger tangled into such a tight knot that it became difficult to breathe. "What is she talking about, Durant?" I asked in a choked voice, looking at my husband, who was standing next to me, his eyes downcast, as if he knew that now he could no longer explain anything without it looking like betrayal. The silence that hung between us was much more eloquent than any words. This moment, the silence, his averted gaze, the restrained tears in my eyes, became that very point of no return, when for the first time in many years I felt that I needed to rewind everything back and understand how we had reached this point, when a loved one turns out to be a liar, and family is an illusion. Let me go back a bit and tell you how it all began, how invisible cracks began to permeate our marriage, imperceptibly, like thin ice underfoot, treacherously breaking at the most unexpected moment. It had been only a few weeks since the funeral of my father-in-law, Mr. Ferrari, a man so gentle and kind that his presence always felt like a quiet but reliable warmth. We grieved, we were silent, we tried to find new rhythms in the silence that filled his absence. The house had become different, too spacious, too quiet, too empty. But time passed, and, as painful as it was, we began to return to normality. And then, at dinner, when it seemed that we were regaining peace, Durant suddenly spoke. "Patricia," he said with that special gentleness in his voice that precedes difficult conversations, "I was thinking that starting next month we could send Mama a little money. Just to support her." At first glance, There was nothing objectionable in this proposal, of course. She is a widow, and perhaps she needs help, especially emotional. But the intonation with which he spoke and the evasiveness of his phrases made me feel wary. "And doesn't your sister Deborah still live with your mother?" I asked, trying to speak evenly, but not hiding my doubts. After all, Deborah was doing well in life, building a career in a large international company, and, as far as I knew, earned many times more than both of us put together. In addition, before retiring, my father-in-law worked in a reputable company. One of those where concern for employees was expressed not only in the dry wording of an employment contract, but also in real support after the end of their working life, and, as far as I knew, he left behind savings that, although not huge, should have provided Mrs. Ferrari with a relatively comfortable existence. So when Durant paused, looking down, before speaking, I already felt the tension building inside me, as if I was expecting something alarming in the back of my mind, and when he finally said that his mother was in more debt than anyone had ever imagined and needed help urgently, I tried to believe it, even though I felt the truth still slipping away from me, like a shadow slipping from under my gaze. He explained that most of my father's pension had gone to pay the hospital bills, the endless medical expenses that had accumulated over the last months of my father-in-law's illness, the funeral expenses, and the medications, some of which even insurance had not covered, and there was something in his voice that made you believe despite your inner doubts. "Mother is in trouble," he said, his face genuinely pained, "but she is too proud to tell Deborah." His eyes were serious, filled with anxiety, and I, immersed in sympathy and a desire to support, finally agreed. We really should help her, because the family should stick together, especially in difficult times. From that day on, our life changed, as if someone had invisibly pressed a button, switching our usual rhythm to a strict economy mode. We began to buy only the bare necessities, refusing what had previously seemed not a luxury, but simply a part of everyday life. Fresh vegetables and fruits disappeared from the refrigerator. Clothes, even when they were worn out, were not replaced with new ones, and trips to a cafe or evening get-togethers outside the home became a rarity, bordering on a memory. Durant began to spend more time at work, and I increasingly fell asleep alone, staring at the ceiling and tried to drown out the growing worries while he returned, tired and silent. However, all the money we managed to save disappeared from the bank account that I thought was his mother's, and although it seemed a little strange to me, since I saw no evidence, no receipts or requests, I suppressed these thoughts, convincing myself that the main thing was trust, and besides, I should be proud of myself, because we were supporting an elderly woman in difficult times. However, along with this false pride, anxiety grew, especially when I could not afford to go to the doctor, even when the temperature lasted for several days, and my body responded with weakness and headaches. One morning, after weeks of feeling unwell and unbearably tired, I passed out in the bathroom, the cold tiles hitting me like a dull thud, and only some time later I came to, shaking, exhausted, with a heaviness in my chest. I had called in sick from work, but my temperature was only rising, and then, with my last stubbornness, I told Durant that I was going to go to the hospital. However, as if he had already prepared his answer, he said calmly and firmly, "We are already short of money, Patricia. Just stay home, take some over-the-counter medication and rest." I was stunned, because it did not sound like concern, but like an order, like an economic decision that had no place for my health. I tried to object, saying that perhaps this was not a simple cold, but the flu or a viral infection, and I needed to make sure everything was okay, but he did not even want to listen. "No hospital," he insisted. "We can't afford to spend money. We're trying to help my mother." The words sounded like a spell, like a shield behind which he hid from having to face the truth, and then for the first time not just irritation but real anger flared up in me. Months passed, filled with the cold of austerity, a fatigue that could no longer be relieved by sleep, and helplessness in the face of this new reality, in which I transferred part of my salary every month to an account that I still believed belonged to Mrs. Ferrari, considering it a temporary solution, a necessity, a sacrifice for the sake of loved ones. And then one day, in the midst of everyday fuss, we decided to pay her a visit, not by chance, but with an obvious purpose, just to check, to make sure that she really needed our help, that everything was as we were told. We knocked on her door, and as soon as it opened, I froze. In the living room, right in the middle of the room, lay open suitcases, neatly folded piles of clothes, bottles of sunscreen, bright hats and guidebooks. Mrs. Ferrari greeted us with such genuine joy that at first I even felt guilty for my suspicions. But her next words hit me like a bolt from the blue. "I'm so glad you both stopped by. I've decided to go to Cancun." Her voice was lively, sparkling, as if she had just won the lottery and was not going through a protracted crisis, which her son had talked about. I was stunned, unable to immediately react, and next to me was the voice of Deborah, who was also at home that day and seemed unusually lively. "Yes," she continued. "Mom and I thought we deserved a break. We'll lie on the beach, explore Mayan ruins, eat tacos, and drink cocktails. It's going to be amazing. You should come too, Patricia. We'll all have fun together." My insides froze. The words stuck in my throat as if I'd swallowed a lump of ice, and my thoughts raced. How can they afford a vacation when we're living hand to mouth? When I was sick with a fever and couldn't afford medicine? When I denied myself a warm jacket? I stared at them, unable to believe that any of this was true, and when I finally found the strength to speak, my voice broke, hoarse and angry. "You've got to be kidding me, right? A trip abroad? How are you planning this when we were sending money to help pay off the debt?" Mrs. Ferrari and Deborah looked at me as if I had just said something completely incomprehensible, as if my words had spoken in a language they did not understand, and the meaning of my outrage had escaped them, like a distant, echoing sound that found no resonance in their understanding of the situation. Deborah, visibly embarrassed but apparently still not comprehending the full extent of my rage, reached out and gently touched my palm in a soothing, almost sisterly gesture, as if to reassure me, like a child who has imagined something frightening. "Patricia, what is it? You look so upset." "If it is about the cost of the trip, we completely understand," she said in that same even, deliberately solicitous tone that only fueled the fire within me. "It is not cheap, yes, but we thought you might want to join us, especially after everything you have been through these past months. You deserve a rest as much as we do." And at that moment, unable to contain the storm of pain, hurt, anger and humiliation any longer, I let everything that had been building up inside me for months burst out, filling the air of that room with a wave of unbridled despair. I told them everything, about the endless saving, about the savings disappearing into the void of bank transfers, about my unbearable fever that I could never cure due to a simple lack of funds, about the sleepless nights when I lay staring at the ceiling and counted whether we would have enough food for the rest of the week, and how I tried to convince myself through clenched teeth that it was for the sake of the family, for Durant, for the sake of his mother, who, I thought, needed help. "We gave priority to your so-called duty, for God's sake." I cried, my voice trembling with tension, no longer caring about outward calm or restraint. "And now you are both planning a luxurious beach holiday. You realize that Durant wouldn't even let me go to the hospital because, as he said, we were barely making ends meet?" My mother-in-law blinked, and her expression changed, softened, but also filled with confusion and genuine incomprehension, as if she had suddenly found herself in a theater where a play was being performed on a subject she had no idea about. "Patricia, dear," she said slowly, "the debt? What debt are you talking about?" I felt my stomach twist, in that physical, piercing way, as if everything inside me had been squeezed into a small, heavy lump. "You know," I said, making an effort to speak clearly, "how much debt Durant says you owe. That's why I give hundreds of dollars a month to help." Her face tightened, and I saw her eyes flicker to Durant, quickly, with a hint of alarm, as if new pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place. "I have no idea what you mean," she said quietly. "I have no debts. I still have your father-in-law's pension, plus some inheritance. My finances are stable enough that I could plan a short trip. I wouldn't dream of traveling if I were in debt." And then the truth, terrible, disgusting, cynical, crashed down on me with deafening force, as if the sky I had been blind to through the daily grind had suddenly fallen on my shoulders, crushing all illusions. I turned slowly to face Durant, who was now standing against the wall as if he were truly cornered, not just physically but mentally, his shoulders tense, his face pale, his eyes darting from the floor to the walls like a man caught red-handed. "Durant," I said, suppressing a shudder, "do you want to explain why your mother knows nothing about this enormous debt you spoke of?" He turned away, exhaled so slowly, as if trying to contain his fear, and murmured, "It's not what you think. I can explain." Deborah, who had been silently watching this exchange until now, suddenly sat up straight, crossing her arms over her chest, and her gaze pierced her brother like a blade. "Explain now," she demanded coldly. "Because you told us, especially Patricia, that mother was in trouble and needed financial help. How are you going to justify this?" Durant's eyes darted between us, first to my sister, then to my mother, then to me, and finally, under the weight of our silent pressure, he gave in. He sighed and said, almost inaudibly, "I go to nightclubs. One of my colleagues got me into it. At first it was just supposed to be for relaxation, a couple of nights a month, nothing serious, but then it became a habit." My vision was clouded with rage, with the blind, dull indignation that burst forth despite my best efforts to remain strong. "So all this time," I whispered, feeling my voice tremble with tears, "the money I thought was going to help your mother was actually going to pay for your nights out? And you had the nerve to act like I was selfish when I needed medical attention? You refused to take me to the hospital because you wanted to save more money for your damn entertainment?" He nodded, looking as if he had aged a decade in an instant. "I know. I'm sorry. After my father died, with all the job changes, I was stressed. Everything seemed unbearable. I just wanted to forget." I stood there silently as the words, the images, the memories rushed in, and everything that had happened between us now seemed false. Those months when I seriously believed that we were saving his mother, that we were sacrificing for the family, that he was suffering too, just like me, while he lied, used my trust like a pocket that he could turn out at any moment. Tears streamed down my cheeks, and I didn't try to hold them back. Tears not only of anger, not only of pain, but also of the desperate realization of a betrayal that had undermined everything I believed in. When I looked at my mother-in-law and Deborah, I saw only shock and sadness, that special, bitter sadness that comes not from events but from the realization that the person you have known all your life is not who you thought he was, and with that discovery not only the idea of him but part of your own history collapses, because the lie you have lived becomes a poison, eating away at the past, the present, and what you called the future only yesterday. Durant's mother, without waiting for anyone else to speak, stepped forward and took my hand gently, almost maternally, her palm warm, trembling, like that of someone who is hurting but wants to comfort someone else, and there was more compassion in that touch than I had expected. "Patricia, I am so sorry," she whispered. "I had no idea my son was telling you all those lies. I swear I would never have let him do this if I had known. It's not fair. It's cruel." Deborah, standing next to me, shook her head, her face flushed with anger, her voice shaking as if every emotion she had held back had burst to the surface. "Durant, I can't believe you'd stoop so low," she said, looking at her brother with an expression that was a mixture of shame and rage. "Patricia sacrificed her own health, gave up everything for this fictitious debt. How could you lie to her so easily? How did you even have the decency to do it?" My husband's words came out in a pathetic attempt at justification, his voice hollow, as if he knew he had no right to justify himself. "I never meant to hurt anyone," he said. "I thought I could make it all back, but I'm in this worse than I thought. I was afraid that if I told the truth, you wouldn't support me. I thought that if I said it was my mother's duty, I could avoid arguments." I felt sick from these words, from this whole ridiculous, vile invention, from the attempt to shield myself at the expense of someone else's compassion. I remembered how he twisted my arm when I wanted to go to the hospital, how his fingers squeezed with unexpected rudeness, leaving a bruise not only on the skin, but also inside, in the place where love should have been. "Do you have any idea how terrible that was?" I hissed, wiping tears from my cheeks. "You made me stay home with a high temperature, with a headache, with a fever, to save money. And all this time you just wanted to continue your miserable nightlife." Durant hung his head, the words caught in his throat, and even now that the truth was laid bare, he could not utter anything that would even slightly justify his behavior. My rage grew like a tide that could not be stopped. I remembered how I stood in front of the discount basket in the supermarket, counting coins, choosing between apples and yogurt, how I put off buying shampoo because it was a little more expensive than usual, how I denied myself coffee in the mornings, which before did not seem a luxury, but an element of comfort, and all for the sake of our imaginary family debt was paid. And now, realizing that it was all a lie, I could not stop the internal storm. I took a deep breath, trying to speak clearly and calmly, although everything inside was shaking. I'm done, Durant. Everything. This marriage is over. I can't live with a man who lies so easily, manipulates and hurts me so much. Not to mention that you have deceived not only me but your mother and sister as well. I want a divorce. My husband's eyes widened in horror and perhaps despair as he finally realized that it was really over, that there would be no chance to replay it or make amends. Wait, Patricia, please, he began, but he did not have time to finish, because at that moment Deborah, with sudden fury, stepped towards him and, without hesitation, slapped him across the cheek with such force that the sharp sound of the slap echoed through the living room like a clap of thunder, and he instinctively covered his face with his hands, astonished not so much by the pain as by the fact of the act. Deborah looked at her brother with tears in her eyes, her voice firm despite the sobs. Don't say a word. You lied about Mom, you took Patricia's money, you denied her medical care. You have no right to ask for forgiveness. Not from her, and not from us. Mrs. Ferrari, who had been holding my hand until now looked at her son with a broken heart, her lips trembling, her eyes full of tears, and there was something more than anger in them, a deep, irreversible disappointment. How could you do this? She asked, her voice breaking. And all this after your father died. This is not how we raised you. We hoped that you would be a man we could count on. Durant opened his mouth, perhaps to protest, to try to explain, to justify himself, or simply to apologize, but he couldn't utter a word. He only swayed as if his strength had left him, and slowly sank to his knees in the middle of the room, tears streaming down his cheeks, dripping onto the floor, and his lips whispered, I screwed up. I don't know how to fix this. I turned away, because I couldn't look at him anymore, because my throat was tight, and a painful lump had formed in my chest that I couldn't swallow. It can't be fixed, I said. You're going to give me back the money, every penny. I don't care how you do it, but I expect every penny to be returned. As for us, it's over. Mrs. Ferrari and Deborah came up to me almost simultaneously, tears in their eyes, and there was a genuine regret in those tears, as if they felt responsible for not seeing it sooner, for not recognizing the lie. Patricia, Deborah said quietly, hugging me tightly. We never wanted this. We really appreciate everything you've done for us, even if it was under false pretenses. Please let me know if there's anything we can do to help. You're not alone. My heart felt unbearably heavy, filled with pain and weariness, but I also realized that this wasn't my mother-in-law's or Deborah's fault. They had been deceived just as much as I had, and they deserved forgiveness, not condemnation. Thank you both, I said. I can handle this. And I don't blame you. But I can't stay married to a man who exploited me, lied to my face, and used my love as a shield from the consequences of his own decisions. I left that same day, returning to the small apartment that Durant and I had once shared, but which was now mine alone. A week later, I moved out completely, leaving behind everything that no longer mattered to me, freeing myself not only from a space filled with memories, but also from the emotional captivity I had lived in for the past months. I found a modest place near work, a small but bright studio apartment where everything was under control, where things were in their place, and where no one could barge into my life with another lie, manipulation, or sudden reality-shattering statement. Luckily, my job, while not exactly promising in terms of career prospects, provided a steady income, and as a full-time employee I could afford rent, utilities, groceries, and even, for the first time in a long time, small pleasures like a cup of coffee at my favorite cafe or a new book bought not with the rest of my salary, but of my own free will, without guilt or calculation. Immediately after moving, I consulted with a lawyer, clearly and unvarnishedly laying out everything that had accumulated, not only in my thoughts, but also in documents, bank transfers that I had been making for months to the account specified by Durant, text messages in which he begged me to help his poor mother, printouts of those evening chats where he justified his late returns by overtime, and even photographs of my dinners, a bowl of noodles, tea without sugar, a piece of bread and butter, while he was enjoying himself in nightclubs, buying alcohol and probably paying for entrance to places where neon lights and loud music reigned, so alien to my needs at that time. The lawyer, attentive and laconic, assured me that I had every reason not only for divorce but also for financial compensation, not as a favor, but as a legitimate return of what was stolen. The proceedings moved remarkably quickly, perhaps because Durant, exhausted, morally crushed and exhausted, no longer had the strength to fight, or perhaps because deep down he knew that arguing against the truth was useless. He did not dispute anything, not a single point, did not deny the facts, did not try to wriggle out of it, did not resort to sob stories. He simply silently signed the papers, and, according to the agreement, had to return to me all the funds that I had transferred to help his mother, plus compensation for the emotional stress that even the court recognized had left a deep mark on my life. I was later told that in order to cope with the sudden financial blow, he took on additional work and now worked at night, having abandoned everything that previously brought him pleasure, nightclubs, alcohol, spontaneous spending, and was struggling to cope with his new obligations. Ironically, the very lifestyle he had so enjoyed had become unattainable, replaced by the toil he had once so assiduously escaped, and now all his debts, emotional and material, were his alone. After the divorce was officially finalized, I received a stream of messages from him in which he seemed to vacillate between remorse and another attempt to exploit my compassion. "I know I screwed up," he wrote. "Please forgive me. I don't go to clubs anymore. I'm not asking you to come back, but can you just lend me some money? Just this once, I promise." He presented it as an emergency, and perhaps it was, but my patience, my nerves, my soul were all burned to the ground, and I was tired of being manipulated endlessly. As soon as the last payment hit my account, I blocked his number, not out of revenge but out of liberation, because even the remnants of pity that had glimmered within me were driven out by the cold memory of the woman he had forbidden to go to the hospital when she needed help. Meanwhile, my connection with Mrs. Ferrari and Deborah not only remained intact, but grew stronger, as happens when shared grief brings people closer together than joy. It wasn't their fault, they were victims too, deceived, set up, drawn into someone else's lies. But unlike him, they didn't shirk responsibility, didn't turn away, didn't try to forget. They called me, wrote short but warm messages, asked how I was feeling, whether I was coping, whether I needed anything, not formally, but for real. And then one day, when we met for lunch at a small family cafe, Mrs. Ferrari suddenly stopped talking, put down her fork, and looked at me with such longing that I felt my heart clench. "Patricia," she said, "it breaks my heart that my son put you through such pain. But I'm grateful that you found the strength to leave. That's respectable." Deborah, sitting opposite me, leaned over, squeezed my hands, and there was no pity in her eyes, only genuine, deep respect. "I have the utmost respect for you," she said quietly. "You've done more for our family than we could have ever hoped for. And no matter what happened to Durant, you'll always be part of our family." I smiled through my tears, the kind that were relieved, not bitter, because their words reminded me that not all the Ferraris had betrayed me. Only him. "Thank you," I whispered. "Your support has helped me heal, both mentally and financially. And who knows, maybe one day we'll actually go to Cancun together. This time, for real, on a vacation without the lies." They both laughed, and though Mrs. Ferrari's voice was still trembling with shame and residual guilt, there was a warmth in it. "Only if you want to," she promised. "And if we do go, it will all be planned together. No secrets. No deception." A wave of relief washed over me, the kind that comes not after a storm, but when you realize the storm is over and you're standing there, a little battered, but whole. In that moment, I realized how far I'd come from that night when I'd collapsed in the bathtub, feverish and with no way to turn to anyone. Now I was free, from the fear, from the lies, from the weight of someone else's guilt. And, for the first time in a long time, I could take control of my life, my money, my body, and my future, without guilt, without anxiety, without the need to explain myself or ask for permission. A few months later, I had gotten used to the new rhythm of life in my cozy apartment, where the silence had ceased to be oppressive and gradually turned into a calming, almost healing presence, giving the opportunity to hear my own thoughts, to feel my breath, to be aware of the flow of time not as a chain of duties, but as a space for myself. Work, as before, took a lot of energy, but now I felt the ground under my feet and knew that every effort of mine was for my benefit and not for the repayment of imaginary debts. I no longer hesitated when I felt unwell. I simply made an appointment with the doctor and went, without fear of looking at the cost of the appointment. The refrigerator was no longer a symbol of lack. It was full. On the shelves lay fruits, greens, yogurts, and even a couple of desserts that I could afford simply because I wanted them. The burden of living for the needs of others disappeared like a shadow in the sun. Mrs. Ferrari and Deborah remained close, in their words, calls, short messages, where there was always room for care. Sometimes I would join them at family gatherings, where the laughter didn't feel fake and the memory of Durant no longer stung. He wasn't invited, and no one discussed it. They said he was drowning in the consequences of his own actions, and though I felt a brief twinge of pity, the freedom I had gained outweighed everything. In the quiet of my bedroom, I would sometimes replay those days in my mind, the lies, the pain, the helplessness, but then I would remember how I had stood up for myself, how I had reclaimed my life, and that was more powerful than any regret. The world had not become perfect. The bills, the stress of work, the fatigue were still there, but now I was dealing with it on my own terms, no longer a prisoner of others' whims. Hope had returned to my life, and maybe one day Mrs. Ferrari, Deborah, and I really would go to Cancun, to meet the sun, to laugh, to let go of everything that no longer had power over us. But even if it doesn't happen, I was at peace with myself, and that was more than enough for now. Leave a comment on what you think about this story and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like it. See you soon.